So this session is really the follow-up to the two sessions I did earlier today in some ways. The first session this morning was about audience and outcomes and really thinking about your learning outcomes for your class and who your audience is and how to deal with that. The second workshop this morning was focused on summative assessment and thinking about what those big ticket kind of assessments are going to be. And this session was going to focus on, once you have those big summative assessments kind of identified, what are some learning experiences you can plan that lead up to those more summative experiences. And this, like the last session, is going to use understanding by design as a little bit of a framework for thinking through this and using the 6 facets of understanding, which I'll go over in a minute. And it's organized by each facet of understanding and ties in a lot of the books that we've done as reading groups around here. Some of the things that have come up are themes and activities that have come up in those books I've mapped to different lenses of understanding to help people think through it a little bit. So one of the things that make more sense to have that up there. One of the things that understanding by design talks a lot about is the idea of uncoverage, or the idea that if you're not an expert in the field, there's actually a lot of things that need to be uncovered about the field to understand what it is that you're kind of talking about. So it's not just kind of identifying the field and some of the things that you're doing in it, but really what does it mean to do the subject or do the discipline that you're actually in. So I found it really interesting that they talk a lot about helping students and non-experts find values of things that might be hidden or not obvious to someone about the field or discipline that they're focused on. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I was just noting, uncoverage is often used in history as a way of focusing on things other than coverage. So that's the first time I've seen it in this context. That's all.
Yeah. The first time I had seen it was in this particular book, and I thought it was an interesting way of framing the idea of kind of getting around something and like it's really the difference between like being an expert and not an expert in something. And so uncoverage is the idea of like making it more obvious to someone who doesn't have that expertise that you do, which is sometimes really difficult if you're the one organizing the class because it seems so obvious to you, right? So sometimes it means you have to step back and remember that it's not obvious to everybody else. The other thing that you need to kind of find balance in is like, what do you want to kind of cover with breadth, right? Like, so where do you need to explicitly connect the dots between subject matters? How are you going to make sure that the like wide range of things that you're covering feel relevant to students' lives? And understanding that we have different kinds of students, so we're going to have to make different kinds of connections for those different kinds of students. And also, what kinds of analogies and things can we use to help develop mental models that help people understand that like this thing over here that seems really disconnected from this thing over here actually is connected, and it is part of this bigger field, and this is how it's interwoven. I think sometimes we think about like chapter 1, here's a topic, here's chapter 2, here's a different topic, chapter 3, here's a different topic, and we don't really talk about how they overlap and weave together and inform one another. Sometimes those relationships are kind of obvious to the expert, but definitely not obvious to a student. And then you also have to think about what you want to cover in depth. So think about any assumptions that you're making or kind of points of view that you're reinforcing. You kind of want to make explicit. If your discipline values particular things, like identify that like this is something the discipline values and that value is embedded in the things that we're doing and kind of point it out. Rather than it just sitting there. You also want to make sure you address common misunderstandings or things that students are going to struggle with and why they struggle with them. Whatever that kind of non-expert coming into something might have a misunderstanding of something that seems, once again, so obvious to us, but really isn't obvious to someone because we might have mislearned it, right? An example in in my field, right, is like, what are the primary colors? Well, people have all kinds of misconceptions of what that is, and then, you know, you have to actually ask some follow-up questions, like, are you talking about the primary, like, color of pigments, or are you talking about primary colors in terms of light? They're different. And, you know, like, there's things that they, you know, people come into, they learn in elementary school that red, blue, and yellow are primary colors, but they're not, just so you all know. But that's like might be the point of view that they're coming in with. So then how do you kind of start to tell them essentially that what they learned was wrong and maybe why they learned what they learned, and kind of start to unpack that. You kind of need to know where they are likely to start. Diving into something with depth also means asking a lot of questions and requiring justification and support for the kinds of things that you're asking them to do. So now I'm going to jump into the different areas of the 6 facets of understanding, and I'm just going to go through each one at a time. So one of the facets of understanding is explanation, and it's often tied to evaluation or evaluating something. It tends to be developmental rather than a task-specific kind of thing. And then you're thinking about, and you want to make sure that you're evaluating breadth separate from depth when you're thinking about explaining something. Yeah.
Can you go into a little bit more depth of what the difference between a developmental rather than a task-specific rubric would be looking towards?
A lot of times that means that you're not necessarily saying like, oh, you are going to like I'll use an design example just because that's where I'm more familiar. You know, a task-specific rubric might be something like, oh, you can validate your code using a code validator. Check. Rather than something that like might show growth from like point A in the semester to point B in the semester, like show improvement, rather than like you can do it or you can't kind of thing. So some things that you could think about in terms of explanation, I have for each thing, I have some quick things that you can do and some like more long-term things you can do in a class. So short things that you could do are things like the 1-minute thesis. You could do open and closing questions at the beginning of or end of a class, kind of asking what they learned, or kind of framing what the day's topic was or what it's going to be next time. And also specific little exercises that might confront misconceptions that you know are common with whatever the topic is that you're going to cover that particular day. Things that are slow or longer term in terms of explanation are doing things like ill-structured problems that don't have a specific answer, that are like more messy. You can think about dialogue or oral-based exams that might be a little more kind of open-ended, that require you to articulate things kind of on the spot. Pure instruction is a good way of doing. And long-term in this case is like you would probably want to do that on a regular basis, kind of long-term. Not like it takes like 2 hours or something. Think, pair, share is another kind of long-term method that you could use over the course of the semester and get students used to doing that. Reiterate core task prompts for essential questions throughout the class. So one of the things that we read in small teaching, for example, was one of the ways to hook students in is to frame the class in terms of big essential questions about the discipline that the course addresses. And so revisiting that through particular exercises throughout the semester could be a way of helping students practice understanding through explanation. And you can also think about spiral course design, where you're kind of coming back to the same topic again and again, and your explanations get more complicated as the semester goes on and more involved. Another one of the 6 facets of understanding is interpretation. So these are things like requiring context, history, audience, right? Those are things that you want to emphasize and have students think through when they're doing interpretation. And you tend to want to connect complex ideas, people, and situations together. So some quick things that you can do in class. include things like case studies, using the Socratic method where you're, engaging in asking questions, and talk alouds. If you're not familiar with a talk aloud, I found it interesting that was in the small teaching book, but also it's something that we use in design a lot. And that's when you ask someone to talk out loud about how they're thinking through a problem or a task that they're doing. So why are they making the decisions, and they're doing that out loud. Doing that in a class and having volunteers do some of that can actually help the class think through processes and things that are a little more complex, and make things a little more visible. It also can help you as a teacher where people are getting hung up in why. So if you're not sure, like that could be a good task. It's a good thing to do one-on-one with students as well if students stuck and you're walking around helping students. Some slower things that you could do, or things that are more long-term that you might want to implement over the course of a semester, are things like a process book. That's something that we do in design, but we've also, faculty have adopted it in other areas outside of design in my department, where you might document how you got from point A to point B on a longer term project. So it reveals your thought process and how you've thought about something and how you dealt with issues, how you've problem solved, how you've iterated things. So you came up with this thing, you tested that idea, it didn't work out, like what'd you do next, kind of thing. And you reveal that process in a process book and document that instead of just thinking about an end product of something that you make. The process becomes more important. Those are places where different kinds of understanding can actually be documented fairly effectively if you prompt students to address it in a particular way. Portfolios can be really good for this because it can demonstrate different levels of understanding in terms of interpretation from early on in the semester to like later in the semester, and show growth over a period of time. You can also think about narratives or persuasive essays as a place where you can do some interpretation. And generally you don't want those to be a quick 2-minute thing, right? Like you want to make sure you spend a little more time on an activity like that. The third facet of understanding that's kind of revealed in Understanding by Design is application. Some of the things that I pulled out about application is the idea that you want to be able to revise and iterate based on feedback. So as you're applying your skills to a particular thing, you want to be able to course correct as you're doing something. And you want to make sure that you're actually evaluating understanding and not the performance. So sometimes, there's students who might, in design, for example, it's like, oh, natural talent, it looks beautiful. Well, that's not necessarily demonstrating that they understand the topics or the specific things that you wanted them to focus on for a particular activity. So you want to make sure that the way that you're evaluating is actually evaluating their understanding and not just the way they performed on a particular task. And that can be a place where I think that's something that happens a little too frequently. And I know that I can be guilty of doing that as well, and try to remind myself not to do that. Quicker things that you can do are case studies or short challenges. So things that might have a time frame associated with them. So in design, for example, we've done things where, you need to do a branding project and you've got 30 minutes and you've got a team. And so it's not going to be something that you would ever do, give to a client, but it's enough to you could work through that same process on a much shorter scale. It allows you to practice some of those techniques and practice the application of what it is that you're trying to do, but the outcome is not going to be, that performance piece isn't going to be in the same place because you haven't spent as much time on it, but it's a good way to practice. Longer term or kind of slower ways of doing application include things like long-term simulations. Simulations tend to require some planning, right? So it's a longer term solution. You might do service learning or community-based learning. You can think through scenarios that might, take place over a longer period of time. Things like reacting to the past or things where you're doing kind of some performance sorts of things might make sense here too. problem-based learning, etc. The fourth facet of understanding is perspective. Generally, you're thinking about evaluating effectiveness, the plausibility, the thoroughness of the evidence, argument style, and not just whether or not it's correct. So again, we want to make sure that we're not just thinking about kind of your answer, but rather like how did you arrive at whatever answer thing, idea that you're putting forth. You want to make sure that the students are demonstrating the ability to infer assumptions that are being made by different voices that might be reflected in whatever you're doing, and anticipate questions that others might have about the claims that you might be making. And then you also might want to be thinking about professional performance standards, which might be different than what you might think of as a student, right? But like, what are the things that we're like working towards? Because the profession has a particular perspective or point of view, and those professional standards might be different than a different professional standard or whatever. So that might be another place to measure. I sometimes think about like the difference of, what a professional standard in design might look like versus like amateur video making or something on YouTube, but have like very different aesthetics and different value systems and things like that. And that can help you understand why there might be something that's really popular on YouTube, but it might not meet professional standards in design. Both could actually be very valuable to society for different reasons, but you have to be able to talk through why is that not acceptable in my class, for example. Even though like, well, they have, 3 million hits. Well, yes, they do. And it's successful on a certain set of measures. Things that you can do for perspective, you can role play. So Reacting to the Past is another place where you can do some role playing. We've had a couple of good podcasts on role playing that I highly recommend that have some ideas about ways that you can do that and implement that in different contexts. You could be asking things about the author's intent of what they wrote, so that you're not just thinking about like what are they saying, but like what did they intend to say, maybe why are they saying what they're saying, what might have informed their perspective. Asking questions about whose point of view, what assumptions are being made, and why is this particular thing important? And important to whom? Might be another question. Good follow-up to that one. Longer term things also include role play. The role play things can be really short or really long. You can think about confronting incorrect or dated narratives or theories. So you might look at the history of your discipline, something that might have been really prevalent for a while. You could actually use that as a text that you're looking at and tackling, and then talk about why it might be dated or how that kind of came to be undone, for example. You could do compare and contrasts. You can do the textbook in comparison to something else that was written, maybe a different textbook or supplemental materials that you find. Sometimes you think about like what's in the canon, right? That might be in like a traditional textbook, and then like what's not in the canon that maybe has a lot of reasons for not being in the canon historically, like perhaps it was women that wrote it or something. And then bring those in and then, use that as a point of comparison. And you can also do things like evaluate arguments. Empathy is another category, one that I think comes up a lot less in the way that we tend to structure our classes. This one happens to really interest me as a designer, and something that I've struggled with a lot in my classes. It's a skill set that designers really, really, really need, because they're always designing things for people who are different from themselves. But it's a difficult skill to teach and develop. So generally, we're thinking about focusing on overcoming egocentrism, ethnocentrism, present-centeredness. There's a lot of things that we might kind of place here. Isms.
So I just want to confirm that this is empathy in terms of the ability to put yourself in another person's shoes. Okay. I thought that was the definition they were using. I wanted to make sure.
Yeah. So some things that you can do that are kind of quicker include things like peer instruction, because you're starting to develop empathy with a peer in your class, because you're trying to explain something to them or understand how they're coming from, what point of view they're coming from, and why they might not agree with you. You can present, write, or design something for a non-expert audience. Kat Blake has done some really interesting stuff, and I think in her freshman class, where she had them look at like a scientific journal article and then like basically rewrite that for a general audience. I think is the gist of kind of what the assignment is. That generally really helps like kind of understand a different point of view, because you need to change how you're writing about something, but also really make sure that you can't explain it to someone who's not an expert unless you really understand it. Like you can't understand it well, or you can't explain it well. And then other things that you can do is like a letter to a future student about whatever the topic is. So that can be helpful too. Longer term things, or things that might be slower that you might not be able to do in just a single class period, include things like arguing a perspective you disagree with or are unfamiliar with. So that generally requires a lot of research and kind of developing that kind of personality, right? So that you can do that. Presenting, writing, or designing for a non-expert audience, like I mentioned before. Ill-structured problems are a great place for empathy, because they're messy, they're complex, all kinds of interesting things come up that you're not planning for. And that always requires you to think through different people's perspectives. And in empathy, that's one of the reasons why I really love community-based learning projects. It's like they always throw a curveball for everybody, including me. Keeps everyone on their toes. And then you can also think about simulation or a direct experience with something with a client or whatever. And then the last category is self-knowledge or metacognition. And this is things like, identifying blind spots or oversights that result from habits, strong beliefs, worldviews, and things that we have. And also separating the knowledge from belief and opinion are some of the things that need to come out, right? What's the difference between, something that is coming from your personal experience and it's something that you might have experienced versus like what are, what's statistically significant or common, that sort of thing. Someone has a comment. Okay, Melissa, if you have questions or anything, feel free to chime in on the chat window and I'm happy to respond to you. So some things that you can do, they're kind of short and quick, are things like exit tickets, pre-tests, so that students kind of know what they know or don't know before they get into a topic. You could ask them to map out, do concept maps. I've done that before in my web design class about typography, and all of the terms and things that we've introduced I cut out so they have here are all the words, and I had them rearrange them in small groups on the table to kind of how are these words related? Can you identify relationships and things? And they, these are a cluster of things that are related. This is another cluster of things related. This cluster is related to this cluster, and kind of put the connection points on. That's a really great way kind of to wrap up something, especially if it's something that builds on in the next unit or something. To help students really break through the things that I thought I understood this, but come to find out I don't. And now that I'm trying to explain this or convince other people in my group that this is a connection that's here, it makes no sense, it's falling apart, and I was able to help students kind of work through some of those things. You can also do frequent quizzing or retrieval practice. I told you it would be here. So this is a great place to help students better understand what they understand. And then longer term things that you can do are kind of self-assessments of past and present work, and doing things kind of over a period of time. So not just doing a one-time thing, but actually asking them to do that over a period of time so they can see growth and change. You can do things like Metacognitive Cafe, like John's done a number of workshops on, we have a podcast on.
With Judy.
With Judy, yeah. And you can also do things like portfolios with reflective essays that put whatever's in the portfolio into a bigger context, and you're asking students to explain themselves about like how they grew, or how their knowledge or understanding of something grew over time, or changed or evolved over time. And that can be really useful. One of the things that's really key about this self-knowledge piece is really building it into class time and asking students to do some of these reflective activities in class, giving them class time to do it, because then it demonstrates to them that you value that activity and it's not an afterthought and it's not an add-on. So if you give class time to that, I think it helps students value that particular way of knowing and understanding, which is often undervalued. Undervalued by students, but perhaps extra valued by faculty. So those are the 6, and a quick overview of some of the kinds of learning activities you can do for each of those. So now I'm happy to open it up for discussion, ask questions. I can go back to slides if you want to see particular things. And Melissa, feel free to chime in by typing if you have questions or things that you want me to address.
I'm monitoring the chat.
Okay, great.
Can you go back one slide?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not sure how many people are familiar with exit tickets, so if you can give an explanation on how those work.
Yeah, and they're used differently in different classes. I mean, there's different ways of doing it. One way that you can do it is asking students to reflect on something that they've learned that particular class and leave it behind, so that you have a good idea of like what students are kind of valuing at the end of class. That's one way of doing it. One is, I still don't understand whatever.
And it's often both.
Yeah.
It's a common one.
Yeah. So you can certainly ask things like that.
And if you don't want to kill trees, there's lots of
I'm gonna
apps.
say John's been doing them digitally, even in his big class, right?
Mm-hmm. I did it with a Google form where you could have 300 or 400 students submit it.
Do you think there's value in delaying it? So rather than doing it as a hand and at the end of the class, say, turn this in tomorrow?
You could. However, the immediate reflection seems to be useful. There was a study done in the Journal of Economic Education. It was a person was teaching 2 sections of intermediate macro. And in one class he used this, the other class he didn't. He was using the same, he was a lecturer primarily, but he was using the same slides, the same tests, the same reading assignments, and he had control variables on the students in terms of their GPAs and so forth. And the students in the class where they use the exit tickets at the end of class, which was 1-minute quiz, he called it, but another name for the same thing, scored about a half grade higher in terms of a half letter grade higher. So.
I think it might be taken a little bit more seriously if you're giving, again, a little class time to do it. Like if it's like, this is how we're going to spend the last 2 minutes of class, every class. And it gets students in the habit of doing it. I think as soon as it becomes something that's like due the next day, or now it's homework, and now it becomes like a whole different beast of something,
And I'll remember to get to it tomorrow, but you never do.
I'll get to it tomorrow, but now I can't remember what we were doing in class because I've had 3 other classes since then.
I graded it, but it was 5% of the grade, and they had to do it every class period.
It was basically like you did it or you didn't do it, right?
It was either, well, I did check, because if they turned in something blank and nonsensical, then I didn't give them credit. But it was a quick scan, basically.
Yeah.
And the nice thing with the Google form is you can just fill out a column and then just change it in the 1 or 2 cases out of 300 or 400 who don't take it seriously. Then upload the grade stripping off the ID, the atoswego.edu, and uploading it right into Blackboard. It makes it really simple.
I'm just, obviously, because where I come from, I'm always trying to map stuff to online. So I'm trying to think then, okay, so at its immediacy, how do you try to encourage students to, okay, read this text, then immediately fill this out? And I'm not looking for an answer. I'm just saying these are some of the thoughts that are bouncing around in my head.
I don't teach online as much as John does, obviously. But there are things that, are certainly, you can certainly use this kind of method in digital technology, right, and digital media. So there's even video systems that at the end of the video, you can have like a short reflection question or things like that. That's what I mean.
Yeah, right in the middle. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're doing specifically the exit tickets, you know, it could be at the end of the video, like what's the, you know, you could have a distinct question at the very end.
Mhm.
In English Comp, they spend a lot of time recognizing alternative points of view and empathizing with others' perspectives. How important is a skill to professors in other disciplines?
I think that's a good question. I think it's not as prevalent in some other areas, right? So I think when you're looking at the 6 facets of understanding, your particular discipline might preference like 2 or 3 of those facets of understanding more than the others. And the argument that understanding by design makes is that if you really want to have more than surface level understanding, you kind of need to do all 6. And, you know, or at least a mix of things, right?
I could think in a calculus class, perhaps alternative points of view on how to find a derivative may not perhaps be as relevant. But in most other disciplines where there is a bit more ambiguity.
Actually, if you go into the Understanding by Design book and like actually read through that section, it does a good job of helping make some connections about why it doesn't, like why you might be resistant to something in a particular discipline. I think it's also important to like, why are you resistant to that? And is there a way to kind of interpret that way of understanding differently than the way that we would expect? So probably a different point of view of a formula doesn't make sense, but there's different ways, you know, I think,
of approaching or modeling a problem.
Yeah, or a process to solve something that like Marcia talked about in her gatekeeping podcast, actually. Might be a place to visit for some of that, actually.
And this is something we'll run into a lot as you start doing your own developments, is you'll, in certain disciplines, get a lot of pushback on why do I need discussions, which generally is where you can insert some of the empathy, but that by far is the one that we get the most pushback out of, and it's the same fields you would expect to have questions about. Where does empathy stand in this?
Well, and empathy, like in a math class, for example, like doing peer instruction and stuff is an activity in empathy. So it's, you know, there's things that kind of are a way of understanding that you don't necessarily always identify up front because it's not something you think about, which is why I took some time to take the small teaching and things that we were reading, like here are some of the ideas that are here and like how could that map to these different ways of understanding. Some of these could certainly fit into multiple categories, but for me it was an activity of, well, how do those activities kind of map to some of these things, or how could I use some of these activities to measure whether or not someone's understanding. And then when you use the mix of activities, that's the key, right? Like you can't just pick from one category. You got to pick activities from all of those categories. And if you're doing a wide range of activities that do different kinds of understanding, then you can make sure that when you get to a summative assessment, they're able to do that more in-depth understanding and it's not surface level, which is, I think, something that faculty like struggle with, right? Like we don't want our students to just kind of be able to scratch the surface. We want them to get a little deeper, and we don't always know how to do that. And I think this gives us a framework for thinking about how to do that or how to think about it, which I personally find interesting.
I guess part of my question/commentary on this would be that it seems like this would be most effective if it's applied at a program level, in terms of, especially if you have something like STEM, there's certain topic areas that lend themselves really well to empathy where you could focus on that, but also in terms of some of the developmental stuff you're talking about. And always thought that that idea of being certain of what people are coming in with after they get their introductory courses is sometimes lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think a program level thinking through this is certainly valuable, but I think that this can happen at all scales, right? Like it can happen at the course level, and it can also happen at a unit level within a course. You can do all of these same things. It takes some time, planning, and care to actually do it effectively and do it well, and really take the time to think about, like, okay, so am I doing something that's metacognitive related to this? Am I having students do, something related to empathy or what have you? And I think even just taking a little inventory for yourself about what is it that you're doing might help you also become a little more reflective and understand yourself, like the things that you tend to preference are the things you tend to measure, right? Because if we're measuring just one most of the time throughout the semester, then we really might be missing someone who actually understands something like fairly well, but we might be missing them or not accounting for their way of understanding something. I mean, it seems kind of strange to say that, but I think that sometimes there's students, for example, in my web design classes who maybe aren't performing well. Like the thing that they're putting out ultimately isn't that strong, but they actually like have some fairly good nuanced understanding of some of the concepts or methodologies and things. And maybe they're not meant to be the person who produces the website, but to be the organizer or to play a different role in that process. And that's valuable within the discipline in the field. But I might have a tendency to preference, like some of the technical, for example. Like I know I do that.
I think some of what you were saying earlier about the talking stuff, just in general, if you can have ways for students to show their thought processes, that's a really good way to identify where their strengths and weaknesses are.
Yeah.
Actually, Doug McKee in an earlier podcast talked about how he used it to build instructional material by having students sit down with him and talk through the problem so he could understand their misperceptions better so he could more directly address those.
So that's the, that on here somewhere. What's that right here? The talk aloud method.
Yeah, the talk aloud.
Yeah, that's what I was referencing. I just didn't remember it.
It's called different things, like in design it's called like user testing. It's the same process though, it's the exact same thing.
You actually just missed that. We did user testing for some of the Blackboard interfaces. We had faculty sit down and walk through what they were looking at to try to improve our directions. I'm not sure how successful we were, but we tried.
But some of these things, by asking students to do some of these activities, you could also probably better understand where their misunderstandings occur and why.
Yeah, they're definitely trying to think outside of the box with our online stuff of how that would work, but I feel like there's definitely ways to do it. It's just
well, I think if I understand, it's okay to combine these into one activity, and you'll see a lot of this stuff is very useful in crafting discussions. And you can use a lot of this like having debate discussions. If there's a topic where there's two choices, you can say, okay, write your response, now go find somebody else that disagrees with you, somebody that agrees with you, and write a post disagreeing with them. So there's a lot of fun stuff that you can do with that.
I think one of the key things though is like a lot of activities certainly cross into different ways of understanding. I think one of the messages to think about here is when you go to evaluate that, are you measuring only one of them because it happens to be easier to measure? Right. Or are you actually considering kind of the different ways of knowing or understanding, like while you're evaluating, and you're actually like treating that like, here's a rubric item, here's another rubric item, here's another rubric item, to make sure that you're actually thinking through that and giving credit for doing one part of it and maybe not the other, or what have you.
Well, that's why I was curious initially about your mention of developmental versus, whatever you called the other type of rubric, is because especially with discussions, we tend to model a very simple rubric. It includes multiple points, so you say, okay, a 4 on this covers all of these things, but unless the faculty member is willing to discreetly break that out.
I think the difference, Doug, is that like on a discussion thing, that's like kind of a recurring small activity that you can't spend a lot of time grading. That if you're gonna, so you do quick things like that, but when you start doing the summative assessment, you need to make sure that you're kind of breaking out the
On a
different
major
kinds
project
of,
or
yeah,
paper or
that you're
something
breaking
somewhere.
out those kinds of things so that you can give some feedback to students so they can say like, oh, I need to do X, Y, and Z more than this. You know, I don't think it's practical on a discussion level, you know, especially if a larger class, like it just isn't practical to evaluate it on those different levels. But you could be making sure that you're asking students to practice those techniques because those are things you're going to ask them to do in a more complicated way in something that's more summative. And that's where you can kind of have more of the nuanced grading. But I think even on those big projects, we sometimes have a tendency to evaluate what's easier to evaluate, measure. I mean, like, sometimes it's hard to put your finger on like, well, how do I know if they empathized? You know, like it requires like learning more about what empathy is and how it and how people demonstrate it in different contexts so that you can even evaluate like that you did that. I find in the work that I do that like the process books and stuff that I require students to do on major assignments helps me understand whether or not a student tried to understand another perspective, right? Because they're kind of documenting that and identifying what some of the techniques are that they've used, how they revise their own, you know, their product as a result of trying to do that particular behavior.
Are there any general resources you would recommend for faculty to become more familiar with the idea of empathy and what it means within the classroom?
I would say just for the 6 facets, like the Understanding by Design book the library has a copy of it. It's a good place. They have a couple of charts and things that you can look them up. If you Google that though too, like there's some charts that you can find online that have pretty good descriptions of what those are. And in the book, they have some different levels. Like here's you know, a D, here's a C, here's a B, here's an A, or like some that show more of that developmental approach to each of those ways of understanding.
Cool.
Yeah, I find that really helpful.
As my off the top of my head guess is that for a lot of our faculty, that's going to be the biggest challenge to sort of wrap their heads around it. Well, how do I evaluate that?
Yeah.
Especially when in the background, the way that we handle our learning objectives is those are very discrete and concrete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do recommend some of the charts and things that are in that particular book. I think it's not always like a quick fix, right? And sometimes it's hard to get your head around it, but just being exposed to that and looking through like, oh, here's kind of a basic level of doing that way of understanding. Here's a complex way of doing that understanding, right? Or a more nuanced way can help you think through how to put something together. The charts are just like really visually complex and a little too much to try to put up on a screen. It's too much to try to read, but they are good to look at. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good.